The day his mother died, the village gathered in quiet mourning. Women wore their plainest clothes, the men bowed their heads, and whispers floated around the courtyard like restless spirits. But behind the cracked wooden door of one home, a different silence hung in the air, not grief, but the soft hush of a woman exhaling after years of holding her breath. Amina had arrived in this house as a bride nearly 10 years ago. Young, hopeful, and full of dreams. She had believed love would protect her, that marriage was a shared promise of kindness. But she had not married just her husband. She had unknowingly wed into a battlefield ruled by a woman who didn't want peace. His mother never liked her. From the very first day, she had searched Amina's face for flaws and found them in everything, in her voice, her clothes, her laughter. She would correct her in front of guests, scold her for meals that were too salty or too bland, accuse her of stealing attention, and remind her every day that she was not the daughter-in-law she had prayed for. And he, her husband, Malik, would stay silent. Sometimes he'd change the subject. Sometimes he'd walk out. And sometimes he'd say, "She's old. Just ignore her." But ignoring cruelty doesn't make it disappear. It just lets it grow roots. Over the years, Amina stopped laughing. She wore dull colors to avoid attention. She gave up her education because his mother believed a wise woman makes a foolish wife. Even when Amina had miscarried their first child, his mother had whispered near the fire that weak women lose children. That night, Amina had cried quietly into her pillow while Malik turned his back and pretended to sleep. Still, she cooked. She cleaned. She prayed. Not for the old woman's death, but for the strength to survive another day. Then one morning, it happened. The mother collapsed outside the kitchen, her breath halting, her grip loosening around the walking stick she had once used to slam the floor in anger. By noon, the village knew. By sunset, the house was filled with mourners. Amina served tea. She wept when expected. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. 3 days later, after the funeral, she stepped outside before sunrise. The house was quiet, the air cool. She stood in the courtyard and looked up at the sky for the first time in years. There was no one watching her from the porch, no voice commanding her to sweep faster or cover her head. She let her braid fall loosely over her shoulder. She walked barefoot in the dirt and didn't rush. Inside, Malik sat staring at his mother's empty chair. "You don't look sad," he said quietly. Amina turned to him. "I'm not." He blinked, stunned. "She hurt me, Malik," she said, her voice calm but steady. "And you let her. For years, I lived like a stranger in this house. Not once did she call me daughter. Not once did you stop her from breaking me." He looked down, his face pale. "I didn't celebrate her death," Amina said. "I'm celebrating my breath, my space, my voice." That night, she changed the curtains to soft colors. She unpacked a box of clothes she hadn't worn in years, bright, bold, free. She put a mirror in the hallway where the mother-in-law's portrait had once hung. The neighbors noticed. Some whispered that Amina had no shame. One elder woman said she should at least pretend to grieve. But another, older than them all, nodded and said, "Sometimes grief doesn't belong to the dead. Sometimes it belongs to the living." Days turned into weeks, and Malik began to see. Without his mother's shadow, Amina was not cruel or disrespectful. She was simply alive. He noticed her smile, her laughter, the way she carried herself with dignity instead of fear. And he finally realized what he had allowed. One evening, he stood beside her as she lit a lamp. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked at the flame, then at him. "I needed you then," she said. "I hope you'll stand with me now." And for the first time in years, he nodded, not just as a husband, but as someone ready to protect what he almost lost. The village still talks about her, how she smiled too soon, how she lit lamps instead of keeping the house dim. But Amina doesn't flinch anymore. She wears her colors. She breathes fully. And every morning, as the sun rises, she celebrates not the death of a woman who hurt her, but the survival of the woman she still is. The drums that played on Asha's wedding day were loud, festive, and full of promise. But deep inside her heart, she had felt the weight of eyes watching her, not with love, but with cold warning. His mother stood at the gate, stiff as a stone pillar, not offering a smile, not even raising her eyes during the ceremony. When the final prayer was said, she had leaned in close to Asha and with a voice dipped in poison whispered, "You may have married my son, but you will never own this home." From that moment on, Asha's marriage felt like a long shadow stretching across her days. Nothing she did was ever right. When she prepared tea, it was either too bitter or too late. When she swept the floor, she was told she was trying to sweep the house away. Even in rituals, his mother would change the incense, rearrange the offerings, and mutter that Asha's hands brought no blessings. Festivals were especially cruel. As other daughters-in-law in the village lit lanterns and sang with joy, Asha was ordered to stay back, watch, serve, never to participate. Rohan, her husband, loved her. That much was true, but he was a son raised to obey. "She's my mother," he would always say, avoiding conflict. "Just be patient." But patience is not protection, and love without courage leaves wounds. In their third year of marriage, Asha's pregnancy was announced. A son, the midwife predicted. But even that joy was stolen. The mother-in-law whispered ancient curses, warning that Asha's womb would bring ruin. That night, a clay lamp shattered in Asha's hands, and she bled quietly into the night. The child was lost. The villagers knew. They pitied her, but no one dared speak against the old woman. She was powerful, respected, feared. Some even believed she held dark prayers in her tongue, that she could bind happiness in knots of jealousy and pride. Time passed, and Asha faded into silence. Her laugh disappeared. Her anklets gathered dust in the corner of a wooden box. She stopped singing, stopped asking, stopped dreaming. Then one day, the curse lifted. The old woman, after weeks of coughing and whispers of illness, finally slipped into eternal silence. The night she died, rain poured across the village, and thunder cracked the sky as if the heavens themselves were cleansing something old and heavy. Rohan cried. The house filled with mourners. But Asha stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She sat by the fire with her hands resting calmly in her lap. And for the first time, no one told her to move. On the 12th day after the burial, as the mourning period ended, something strange happened. Asha opened the box that had held her anklets for years. She wore them again, their soft jingles like distant bells from a temple. She bathed early, wore a sari of soft yellow, and tied fresh flowers in her hair. When the neighbors came by, she greeted them with chai and a faint smile. "Asha," one of them whispered, "today is the first day you're allowed music again." She nodded, and then, without warning, she stepped into the courtyard. Asha danced. Her feet struck the earth gently, rhythmically, like prayers finally set free. Her arms flowed, like wind, through the crops. It wasn't wild. It wasn't disrespectful. It was sacred. A release. A return. From a distance, some women gasped. So soon? How can she dance so soon after her mother-in-law's death? But the eldest woman in the village, blind in one eye but wise beyond years, smiled and said, "She is not dancing because the woman died. She is dancing because the cage finally opened." That evening, Rohan watched from the doorway, unsure, ashamed, awed. She looked at him, her eyes no longer dim. "I was never your mother's enemy," she said softly. "I only wanted space to be me." He stepped forward. "I know," he said. "I see it now." Later that night, he lit incense not for his mother, but for peace, and placed the flame in the center of the home, between Asha and himself. From that day on, Asha reclaimed the spaces she was once forbidden to enter. She decorated the prayer room in her own way. She changed the curtains in the sitting area. She sang while cooking and laughed without flinching. And sometimes, when the courtyard filled with sunlight, she danced, not in joy over death, but in celebration of survival. They said laughter was a sign of disrespect. At least, that's what Miriam had been told from the moment she stepped into her husband's family home. "You laugh too much," his mother would hiss, lips tight, eyes sharp. "A good wife is quiet. A good wife does not show all her teeth like a market girl." So Miriam stopped laughing. Slowly, cautiously, piece by piece, she hid the parts of herself that had once made her glow. She had come from the town, not a big city girl, but not raised in the dust either. She liked her hair in neat braids, wore soft perfume, and owned a pair of red sandals her friends used to admire. She had dreamed of marrying a kind man, building a joyful home, and filling it with children, music, and meals where people talked openly. But in her husband's village home, joy was rationed. The old woman, her mother-in-law, ran the household like a prison of tradition twisted by bitterness. The food had to taste like her cooking, the women had to sit the way she sat, and no opinion could be voiced unless filtered through her authority. When Miriam miscarried her first child, she cried silently, her husband holding her hand through the night. But by morning, the old woman had already begun. "Maybe it's that lipstick," she said coldly. "Maybe your womb is not strong because your spirit is too loud." Miriam said nothing. Her husband stayed silent too, lost between guilt and fear of his mother's wrath. It happened again a year later, another child, lost before it could bloom. The whispers grew louder. Some women in the village began avoiding eye contact. And one morning, after Miriam came back from the health clinic wearing a soft pink shawl, her mother-in-law stared and said, "You walk like a woman who doesn't carry shame." That day, Miriam packed away her favorite clothes, the red bangles, the lipstick, even her perfume. She became a ghost of herself, alive, present, but barely. Her laughter became a memory, like something she had once owned and forgotten where she left it. But fate, even when cruel, does not stop moving. The old woman fell ill in the dry season. Her strength faded quickly, but her tongue remained sharp. Miriam nursed her out of duty, not affection. She fed her, cleaned her, endured her last words of bitterness whispered through cracked lips. "She'll wear red when I die," the old woman muttered once, "because devils celebrate when saints fall." And then, one morning, just before the rooster's cry, the house went still. The old woman had passed. The village mourned as expected. She had been feared, yes, but also respected. She had fasted often, donated to the mosque, and spoken with authority. The men remembered her discipline. The women feared her tongue. So they came, dozens of them, dressed in pale colors, heads bowed, voices soft. Miriam wore white too. For 3 days, she played the role, served tea, sat in silence, accepted condolences. But on the 4th day, she rose before the sun. She opened her box of hidden things, the red dress, the bangles, the hair oil she had almost forgotten the scent of. She bathed, oiled her skin, and for the first time in years, dressed not to hide, but to feel. When she stepped into the courtyard, the morning sun struck the red like fire. She stood tall. Her hands moved gracefully, adjusting her dupatta. And then, she did something no one expected. She laughed. Not loud, not wild, but free. A soft, real laugh, like a bird testing its wings again. Her husband stood frozen in the doorway. "Miriam," he whispered, unsure whether to stop her or let her continue. "She's gone," Miriam said. "And I'm still here." He looked at her, this version of her he hadn't seen in years, and said nothing. Outside, the neighbors saw her. Some gasped. One woman even muttered, shameful. But the village elder, the one who had buried more people than she could count, simply smiled and said, "Sometimes a woman does not cry because she has cried enough." Later that evening, Miriam cooked the meal she wanted. She played music low under her breath. She smiled at her husband across the table. And when he finally smiled back, she laughed again. Not because she was happy that someone had died, but because she was no longer being smothered while alive. It wasn't joy over a death. It was relief over her own return. When the old woman died, the house became quieter, but not peaceful. For years, Zainab had lived in her mother-in-law's home like a careful guest. She walked softly, spoke only when spoken to, and always ate last. Her husband, Idris, loved her in the quiet, uncertain way of a man torn between two loyalties. And his mother, stern and watchful, made it clear from the first day that Zainab was not her choice, not her blood, not her reflection. "I know your type," she had said when they first met. "You smile too much and dream too big. Keep your head low and you'll survive here." Zainab tried. She folded her dreams into her wedding sari, stored them in boxes under the bed, and learned to swallow her pride with her evening tea. For 10 years, she endured the silent dismissals, the sharp looks, the small cruelties that made the house feel colder in every season. But then the mother-in-law grew sick, and within a few months, the woman who had ruled the household with an iron will and a locked mouth passed away without drama, just a final breath and a blank stare. Zainab mourned, not for the woman, but for what she could have been if the house had been warmer, if her love had been returned, if she had been seen. The funeral came and went. People offered prayers, advice, and whispered condolences that often felt rehearsed. Then, a week later, a lawyer came. He was a distant cousin from a city, carrying a file of documents. The family gathered in the front room. Idris, Zainab, the uncle from across the village, and 2 nosy cousins. The room smelled of old incense and dry silence. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the will. To Idris, the only son, she left the house and the fields. To the eldest cousin, a portion of gold coins from an old trunk. To the mosque, a donation. To Zainab, nothing. Not a word. Not a name. A pause followed. Heavy, suffocating. Idris looked up sharply. "That must be a mistake," he said, his voice already trembling. The lawyer shook his head. "This was written and signed 2 years ago." She was clear. Zainab sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her face unreadable. The cousins avoided her gaze. The uncle looked at his feet. Idris reached for her hand, guilt swimming in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know." She looked at him, calmly, clearly, and said, "I did." She had always known. That day, she went to their room, opened her trunk, and slowly began to unpack the things she had once buried: a set of bangles her mother had given her, a small diary she hadn't written in since marriage, and the sari she had dreamed of wearing to her first festival as a wife. A sari she never got to wear because the old woman had said red was too bold for a daughter-in-law. Zainab wore it that night. She walked into the courtyard lit by the setting sun, the red fabric flowing like freedom. The neighbors who peeked through their fences gasped. "She's wearing red," one whispered. Just a week after the funeral? But the elder midwife, who had seen generations of women bend and break and heal again, nodded slowly. "She's not celebrating the death," she said. "She's celebrating that her worth was never written on a piece of paper." Inside, Idris sat stunned. "She left you nothing," he said again, as if repeating it might change it. "She tried to erase me," Zainab said softly, "even in death. But now I finally know where I stand and where I don't need to stand anymore." In the following days, she stopped asking for permission. She started cooking her favorite dishes. She joined the village women at the well and laughed freely, openly. She began stitching again, not just mending old clothes, but creating new things. Bold things. Things she could sell in the market. Idris watched her, slowly realizing that the woman he had married had always been there, just hidden under layers of forced silence. One evening, as they sat outside, he said, "I want to add your name to the land deed." She shook her head gently. "I don't need your land," she said. "I just need your voice next time someone tries to erase mine." He nodded, and for once, she believed he understood. Zainab never cursed the dead, but she never cried for them either. Because in losing everything they denied her, she found everything they couldn't touch. Her courage, her laughter, her voice. For 10 long years, Amira lived in the same house, but never truly belonged. She entered it young and full of hope, holding her husband Yusuf's hand as they crossed the threshold after their wedding. The drums had faded, the henna still fresh on her palms. But that first night, when she tried to help his mother prepare tea, she was firmly told, "Guests don't enter the kitchen." She wasn't a guest, of course. She was the new bride. But the message was clear, she wasn't family either. From that day onward, she lived on the edge of every room, like furniture that could be used but never fully accepted. His mother, a tall, sharp-eyed woman named Mama Halima, ruled the house like a queen. Her sons obeyed. The daughters-in-law tiptoed. But Amira was treated with special distance. Not open cruelty, just silence, sarcasm, and small exclusions that stung more than slaps. She was never asked about her opinions. At meals, she served but wasn't served. She wasn't allowed to join family discussions. When visitors came, Halima introduced everyone proudly, except Amira, who was always the wife of Yusuf. The day she lost her first pregnancy, Halima didn't comfort her. She merely said, "Don't cry in the sitting room. It brings bad luck." Yusuf loved her, but like many sons raised by strong mothers, he stayed quiet. "She'll come around," he would say. "She's like this with everyone." But she wasn't. She kissed the other grandchildren. She made sweet rice when the other daughter-in-law passed an exam. She kept photos of everyone in her room. Everyone but Amira. Still, Amira endured. Out of duty. Out of hope. Out of the quiet belief that if she just kept serving tea, just kept lowering her eyes, maybe one day, she'd be seen not as a shadow, but as a daughter. That day never came. Instead, one morning, without warning, Mama Halima's heart gave out. She collapsed in her chair while sorting beans in the front veranda. The house, suddenly, was full of noise. Mourners, wailers, prayers, condolences. Amira stayed in her room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't glad. She simply felt nothing. When someone asked why she wasn't preparing food for the guests, she said calmly, "I was never part of this house. Why should I pretend now?" Yusuf didn't argue. He couldn't. The funeral went on without her. She lit incense in her own room, prayed quietly, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. And then, when the last mourner left, something shifted. That evening, Amira walked into the center of the house and opened every window. She swept the floors with her own rhythm. She removed the old lace tablecloth Halima had insisted never be touched and replaced it with one of her own, soft blue, embroidered with flowers. She went to the room where Halima had once kept a cabinet locked and, for the first time in 10 years, opened it. Inside were linens, prayer mats, old photographs, and a small box of jewelry. Amira didn't take a thing. She simply looked, and then closed it. When Yusuf returned from walking his relatives out, he found her standing in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred lentils. He watched her for a moment, something unfamiliar flickering in his eyes. "You're cooking?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "In my kitchen." He blinked. "Your kitchen?" She turned to face him, her voice steady. "This house never felt like mine. But today, for the first time, I'm not waiting for anyone to tell me I belong." Yusuf nodded slowly. He walked to her side and began chopping onions. Not as a gesture of help, but of acknowledgement. The next morning, Amira rearranged the sitting room. She invited her younger sister over for lunch. She even laughed, openly, when her nephews spilled juice on the floor. Some neighbors whispered, "She didn't even attend the burial properly. She's already changing the curtains." But the village midwife, who had seen 3 generations of women come and go, said quietly, "Sometimes you bury more than a body at a funeral. Sometimes you bury silence." Days turned to weeks. The house became lighter. Children laughed again. The stove stayed warm. Amira planted flowers in the yard, something Halima had always forbidden. And one morning, as she swept the front steps in the rising sun, a passing woman greeted her and said, "This house looks different now." Amira smiled. "It finally feels like home," she replied. Not because someone gave her permission, but because she stopped waiting for it. There are prayers people say aloud, during storms, weddings, or childbirth, surrounded by others, hands lifted high, voices trembling with hope. But Areba's prayer had been whispered in the dark. Alone. Silent. Barely a breath. She hadn't prayed for riches. Or for a child, though the village women often hinted that she should. She hadn't asked for beauty, or love, or power. All she had asked for, the one thing her soul quietly begged for, was peace. Just peace. Reby had grown up believing marriage would bring her joy. She believed in cooking with love, speaking gently, and lighting the clay lamp in the prayer room each evening with hope. But when she entered her husband's family home, reality wrapped around her like barbed wire. Her mother-in-law, a woman of stiff rules and colder words, quickly made it clear that Reby was merely an addition to her son's life. Not a partner, not a daughter, certainly not a human being with needs or dreams. "You're not here to be happy," the old woman said once. "You're here to serve, to obey, and to keep quiet." Reby obeyed. She served tea before her own feet stopped aching. She rose before dawn and went to sleep long after the rest. She handed her salary to her husband, who handed it to his mother. She dressed the way they liked, spoke only when spoken to, and never once sat at the table before the elder woman had taken her place. And yet, her silence was never enough. One night, after being accused of letting the curry burn, even though it hadn't, Reby stepped into the open courtyard and looked up at the stars. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and whispered 3 words into the night. "Give me peace." That was all. Months passed. Nothing changed. If anything, the household grew heavier. The old woman became more possessive, more paranoid. Reby's husband, caught in his mother's grip, became distant. She began to forget what laughter sounded like in her own voice. Then came the fever. The mother-in-law fell sick in the middle of the monsoon season. At first, she barked commands from bed, still sharp-tongued. But within days, her voice faded. Her hands trembled. Her once unshakable presence became pale and paper-thin. Reby nursed her. Not with hate. Not with glee. Just quiet duty. Spoon after spoon of warm broth. Cold cloth on the forehead. Gentle hands, the way her own mother had once shown her. And then one evening, the breath simply stopped. A gasp, a flutter, and silence. People came. Prayers were offered. The village mourned a strong woman who had ruled her home like a fortress. Reby didn't weep. She didn't speak much. She simply moved through the rituals like a ghost floating between duty and numbness. But 3 nights after the burial, something shifted. Reby entered the prayer room, the one she had been told never to decorate in her own style, and lit a single candle. Its flame flickered, soft and golden, reflecting in her eyes. She sat down, and for the first time in years, she breathed without flinching. She remembered her prayer, that quiet night under the stars, and realized it had been answered, not in anger, not in blood, but in time. Not a curse, a release. She didn't smile widely. She didn't dance or shout. But as the candle burned low, a single tear fell down her cheek, and she let herself smile. A smile of grief. A smile of survival. A smile of peace. The next morning, she changed the curtains in the main room, soft green, like the color of eucalyptus trees after rain. She brewed cardamom tea the way she liked it. She placed a small plant on the windowsill and watered it herself. Some relatives noticed. "Strange," one whispered. "She's changing things already." But the imam's wife shook her head gently and said, "She's not celebrating death. She's honoring the life she finally gets to live." Her husband, too, noticed. The stillness in her voice. The strength behind it. He had expected tears. Pleading. Instead, he saw clarity. And in that clarity, he finally saw her. He apologized, late, soft, sincere. "I never knew how much she controlled you," he admitted. Reby looked at him, not with anger, but with something older than pain, quiet knowing. "I didn't need control," she said. "I only needed peace." Now, when she enters the prayer room, she lights 2 candles. One for the dead, and one for the living. The second one is for her. The woman who finally, after years of quiet suffering, got the answer to her whispered prayer. The funeral ended at sunset. The village path was still wet from the morning rain. Women returned to their homes in slow steps, whispering behind their shawls. Men spoke in low tones about the old woman, a strong, firm figure now gone. But in one corner of the courtyard, a younger woman stood in silence, her sari the color of ripe mango, bright, bold, unapologetic. It was Zobeida, the same daughter-in-law who had lived in that house for 12 years. The same one who hadn't shed a tear that day. The same one the village women now watched with narrowed eyes. "Who wears orange after a funeral?" one of them muttered. "She didn't even cry," another added, as if grief were measured in salt water. "Shameless girl," said a third, too eager to be seen. But none of them had truly seen Zobeida, not then, and not for all the years before. Behind the bright fabric was a story stitched together by silent suffering. From the day she arrived in her husband's home, Zobeida was treated like a temporary guest, one who never left. Her mother-in-law, Hajra, was known in the village for her discipline. But inside the home, that discipline turned into something colder, sharper. Cruel. Zobeida was mocked for her accent, her slim figure, her opinions. "Speak less," Hajra would snap. "A smart daughter-in-law knows when to disappear." Her food was always too salty. Her silences were always disrespectful. Her joy was always too loud. When she laughed during her first month of marriage, Hajra slapped the table and said, "Laughter is for women who forget their place." Zobeida never laughed in front of her again. When she miscarried her second child, Hajra didn't ask if she was in pain. She only muttered, "You carry like a broken basket." Her husband, Raymond, tried to stay neutral, which meant silent. "It's her house," he would say. "She's old. Don't take it to heart." But hearts don't work that way. Bruises form whether you're told to ignore them or not. For years, Zobeida dressed in dull tones. Gray, mud brown, off-white. She wore them like armor. To survive another day of being invisible, insulted, dismissed. But even quiet women have secret boundaries. And sometimes they break, not with noise but with color. The night Hajra died was quiet. No thunder, no drama. Just a slow breath, a final blink, and stillness. Zobeida washed her body, folded the burial cloth, sat through every prayer. But not once did she pretend to mourn. 3 days later, as per custom, she was expected to wear soft shades and avoid attention. But that morning, Zobeida opened her old wedding trunk. She took out the orange sari she had bought long ago, one Hajra never let her wear because bright colors attract misfortune. She wore it. She braided her hair. She stepped out into the sun like a woman stepping out of a grave. The gasps came quickly. "She's dancing in her heart," someone whispered. She couldn't wait, could she? How can she be so bold so soon? Zobeida heard them all. But she didn't shrink. Not this time. She walked to the center of the courtyard, stood still for a moment, and then sat beneath the neem tree, the one where Hajra used to sit and watch her every move. She sat there and simply existed. Fully. Freely. Her husband approached, unsure. "You're causing talk," he said cautiously. Zobeida looked at him, not with anger, but with deep, quiet truth. "Let them talk," she said. "They didn't live my silence. I'm not celebrating her death. I'm honoring my survival." Raymond looked away, ashamed. "I didn't know it was that bad." She raised her eyes to him. "You chose not to see." He didn't argue. That evening, Zobeida lit a lamp in the prayer room and placed a single marigold beside it. Not for the dead, but for the version of herself that had finally returned. The village would keep whispering, they always did. But slowly, a few women began to understand. One brought her a mango from her tree. Another sat beside her and asked softly, "Was it truly so hard?" Zobeida nodded, tears gently lining her lower lashes. "But I made it. And that, more than anything, was worth wearing orange for." For years, he had told her, "You're overthinking," whenever she tried to speak her truth. She's just strict.
She means well.
She treats everyone the same. But after his mother died, and silence finally wrapped itself around the house, Idris found something that shattered everything he thought he knew. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral. The mourning period was over, but the air still carried a heavy kind of quiet. His mother's belongings were untouched, her cupboard locked, her notes scattered across the prayer table. He entered her room one evening, not out of longing, but obligation. There, tucked inside a worn metal trunk beneath old shawls and prayer beads, he found it. A bundle of letters, a set of cassette tapes, and a notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. Curious, he opened one letter. It was addressed not to him, not to anyone in the family, but to a friend in another village. The handwriting was sharp, the words bitter. Page after page, his mother vented about Zainab, his wife. The insults were cruel. The lies were carefully written. She's lazy, manipulative, trying to turn my son against me. I've told her she will never rule this house. Idris read them all, one after another. Some dated just last year. His hands shook. The tapes were worse. On one, his mother had recorded a rant after an argument with Zainab, not knowing someone had left the recorder running. Her voice, full of poison, said things like, "I'll starve her of respect until she begs to leave." Another tape had a quiet, muffled argument. Zainab's voice, trembling, said, "Why do you hate me?" And his mother coldly replied, "Because you dared to think you belonged here." Idris sat frozen, the tape spread before him, the truth crashing in waves over his guilt. He remembered the times Zainab had come to him, eyes red, voice quiet. "She never listens to me. She treats me like a burden. I don't feel safe here." And every time, he had dismissed it. "You're too sensitive. She's old-fashioned, but she loves you. Let it go." Now, he couldn't let it go. He had held silence while his wife held pain. That night, he didn't say a word. He cleaned the tapes, folded the letters, and stepped outside to where Zainab was sitting alone under the neem tree, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chai. She looked up when she saw him. She hadn't cried for his mother. Not once. But she had been gentle,
Quiet.
respectful. "I found them," he said softly. "The letters. The tapes." Her hands paused. "She hated you," he said, "and I let it happen." Zainab didn't speak. Her silence wasn't bitter. It was exhausted.
Worn.
Familiar. "I never really saw what she was doing to you," he went on. "But you saw it all, and you stayed." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting years of endurance. "I didn't stay because I was weak," she said. "I stayed because I hoped one day you would see me.
Not just hear me.
See me." He sat beside her, the air thick with truth. "I see you now." A long pause. Then Zainab did something unexpected. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a tiny clay lamp. Without a word, she lit it, placed it between them, and let the flame dance. "Tonight," she said softly, "isn't about her death. It's about the truth finally breathing." Idris lowered his gaze. "Can I sit with you in that truth?" She nodded. And together, they sat, two people not mourning a loss, but honoring a survival. That night, for the first time in their marriage, he didn't try to fix her pain. He simply believed it. The next morning, Idris took down the portrait of his mother from the central wall and placed it on a side shelf. He didn't erase her memory, but he made space for his wife's dignity to live in the center of the home. In the weeks that followed, he defended Zainab when others whispered that she didn't mourn properly. He told the truth to his brothers. He began to repair what he had let break. And Zainab? She began to laugh again. Not loudly, not daily, but freely. Because once the truth is finally seen, silence no longer feels like home. There was always one room in the house that remained locked. Not because it was damaged. Not because it was filled with valuables. But because Hajra Begum, the matriarch, said so. "No one enters this room," she had declared the day Zainab became her daughter-in-law. "Especially you." No reason. No explanation. Zainab was young then, new to the rhythms of married life. She had arrived with dreams of blending into her husband's world, cooking together, sharing laughter, and slowly building her own corner of the home. But Hadra made it clear from the start, this house would never be hers. She wasn't allowed to decorate. She wasn't allowed to repaint the walls. Even putting up a family photo required permission. And the room? It was at the end of the hall, always padlocked, its windows covered with thick jute cloth. Occasionally, Zainab would see her mother-in-law emerge from it, carrying old prayer books, dusty tins, sometimes nothing at all. But she never spoke about it. Curiosity is poison in a woman. Hadra once snapped when Zainab stood near the door too long. Over the years, the locked room became more than just a space. It became a symbol of control, of exclusion, of power. Zainab learned to walk past it without glancing. She learned to breathe around her invisibility. Her husband never questioned it. She has her reasons, he would mumble. Let her have her space. But Zainab had no space. Not even a corner she could call her own. And then, one morning, Hadra Begum died. No warning. Just a sharp chest pain, a stumble, and silence. The funeral happened fast. Relatives poured in, prayers echoed through the courtyard, and the air turned heavy with ritual and memory. Zainab didn't cry. She didn't pretend to be devastated. She performed every duty with calm respect, washing the body, arranging the bedding, serving tea. But something inside her had quietly shifted. 3 days after the funeral, once the house emptied and the mourning period passed, Zainab stood alone in the hallway, facing the locked room. The key was still hanging from the old iron nail in the kitchen, where Hadra always kept it hidden behind a ladle. Zainab took it down. Her hands didn't tremble. She walked to the door, inserted the key, and turned. The lock clicked open with an eerie ease. The room inside was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't full of secrets or treasures. Just old furniture, faded photographs, half-used saris, rusted trunks, and silence. But more than anything, it was empty. And in that emptiness, Zainab saw what Hadra had been trying to protect all along: authority. The room wasn't sacred. It wasn't special. It was just hers, and hers alone. Zainab stood in the doorway for a long time. Then, slowly, she stepped inside. She opened the windows, let the sunlight pour in. She pulled down the jute covers, shook out the dust. She swept the floor with her own hands and wiped every surface. And for the first time in 12 years, she claimed space. Over the next few days, the room transformed. She painted the walls pale blue, the color of calm. She hung up her wedding photo, her parents' portrait, a sketch her niece had drawn for her years ago. She added cushions, a bookshelf, a small radio. And music returned to the house. Soft folk songs during the day. Classical tunes in the evening. Sometimes she even hummed along while folding clothes. The neighbors noticed. "Didn't that room used to stay locked?" one woman asked. "Yes," Zainab replied with a smile, "but locked rooms serve no one after the keykeeper is gone." Some villagers whispered. "Too bold," they said. "Too fast after a funeral." But others, quietly, admired her. Her husband noticed too. One evening, he stood at the doorway of the new room and asked, "You're making it yours?" Zainab looked up. "It was never mine. Now it finally is." He nodded. She would have hated this. Zainab didn't argue. She just turned up the music a little louder and continued arranging the fresh marigolds in a clay vase. Because she wasn't mourning a death. She was reviving a life, hers. And that locked room, once a symbol of control, now sang with color, light, and freedom. It was the night she gave birth, still weak from labor, still bleeding, still holding her newborn daughter close, when Hadra Begum slapped her. Not once.
Twice.
Another burden. Hadra hissed, her face twisted in disgust. "You gave me shame." Zainab remembered that moment more clearly than the birth itself. The pain of her body faded. But the sting of that slap, and the bitterness in those words, never did. From that day on, her daughter wasn't a blessing. She was a weapon Hadra used against her. "Don't dress her like a queen. She's just a girl. She'll bring curses like her mother." Why educate her when she'll just go off and shame us with her choices? Zainab never responded. But every insult became a thread she silently pulled together, weaving into her resolve. She named her daughter Aisha, meaning life, even when Hadra insisted on a different name. She taught her to read even when the old woman said, "Girls with too many words become wives with no respect." She combed her hair with oil and whispered, "You are not a curse. You are my beginning." Her husband, spineless in front of his mother, stayed mostly silent. "She's just old-fashioned," he'd mumble. But to Zainab, Hadra wasn't old-fashioned. She was cruel. Every year, Zainab stayed in that house like a shadow, forbidden from celebrating her daughter's birthday, forbidden from singing lullabies too loudly, forbidden even from smiling too long when Aisha danced in the courtyard. And then, without warning, Hadra Begum fell sick. Old age, the doctor said. Weak heart. One evening she simply closed her eyes and never opened them again. There were no final words, no apologies, no glimmer of regret. The village came to mourn. Neighbors wept. The family gathered. Zainab remained calm. She bathed the body. She dressed it. She served the mourners. But in her chest, there was no grief, only peace. That night, when everyone else was asleep, Zainab walked into her daughter's room. Aisha was 13 now, clever, bold, beautiful. Zainab sat on the edge of her bed and whispered, "You are free now." Aisha blinked sleepily. From what? Zainab kissed her forehead. From the woman who wanted to dim your light. The next day, Zainab wore a soft orange scarf, not black. She cooked sweet rice instead of bitter tea. She opened the windows and played a soft tune on the old radio Hadra used to scold her for using. The village women noticed. "She's not mourning properly," they whispered. "She's celebrating." But none of them knew. None of them knew how many times she had cried herself to sleep, afraid her daughter would grow up thinking she was unwanted. None of them knew how many bruises she had covered with long sleeves and silence. None of them knew that this wasn't joy. This was justice. Later that evening, Zainab took out Aisha's books and started preparing her admission to the nearby girls' college. Hadra had once vowed that no girl from this house would ever step beyond her limits. Zainab was going to make sure Aisha stepped far beyond them. When her husband tried to object, weakly, lazily, Zainab didn't shout. She simply looked him in the eyes and said, "If I could survive your mother's cruelty, I can survive your silence too." He didn't argue again. Weeks later, Zainab was seen in the village center, laughing. Not out of disrespect, but out of relief. Women stared. A few whispered. But one old widow pulled her aside and said, "You must have endured a mountain of pain to laugh like this." Zainab smiled. "My daughter will never be slapped for being born. That's my victory." And that was the day Zainab truly celebrated, not because someone had died but because a future had been reborn.